know my title might not have been super clear. I'm not going to be teaching you how to make your transitions beautiful. I'm going to be talking about the transitions framework as a whole, and hopefully you can take that back and do the creative work on your own to make them beautiful. So why are we talking about transitions in the first place? The reason is abrupt transitions are jarring. And it's not just visually jarring. This big red bold background, sure, your users are going to be like, wow, what the heck just happened to my screen? But it's also cognitively jarring because you're taking them out of the context of what they were looking at, throwing up something completely different, and this is the result. So when we start doing more smooth transitions, like a fade, it provides continuity. So even if the content isn't at all related to what you were looking at before, the fade gives them the feeling that they're still immersed in your app. These transitions also, because of that, keep your users engaged in what they're looking at. So if you're going from a list screen to a detail screen, they're going to be still engaged in the app without taking them out of that context. And then smooth transitions can also delight users. I hope by now you guys have all used enough of the really awesomely designed material apps that you've seen at least one animation that you see it and you have to go back and do it 3 more times just because it's kind of fun to do. Particularly the circular reveals and the ripples and stuff like that are just neat little interactions that make users feel like you actually care about their app. So from the material design docs, in the world of material design, motion describes spatial relationships, functionality, and intention with beauty and fluidity. What that means is if we're buying into the material design philosophy, our elements can't just be static elements that disappear and reappear when we make transitions between different scenes. They have to be actual objects that move, right? If I have a ball in my hand and I want to transition to not having a ball in my hand, it doesn't just disappear, right? It's going to roll away, I'm going to throw it, it's going to soar through the air, whatever, but it's an actual physical object that exists in a physical world. So as an example, this is the Play Music app, and you can see that when we click on an album, the whole card expands to fill the screen, and the image stays on the screen. It doesn't just fade away and then come back in. And for the most part, the other content isn't just going poof. And as a side note, I wanted to do this because as I was making this presentation, I was playing around with PowerPoint's animations a little bit, and I wanted to make the point that you have to be careful about your animations. You don't want to go overboard because, yeah, you can do fun things. If you really wanted to, you could take the Android Transitions Framework and you can make an origami swan that flies away. But you really shouldn't, because that's not adding any meaningful motion to your app. It's just, hey, this is kind of cool and I want to do it because I'm bored. So the Android Transitions Framework provides us with a couple different types of transitions that we can do. We can do transitions between activities, we do them between fragments, and we do them between what we call scenes, which are just views on the screen. So we'll talk about each of those in a little bit more detail. But first, I'm guessing most of you are wondering, what kind of support is available for this? How can I support it if I am using Min SDK 8? The answer is sort of. The actual transitions do require API 21, Lollipop. However, it's time to start talking in the mobile world about progressive enhancement and graceful degradation, which are terms that we've used in the web world for a long time. But in terms of Android, we kind of just fall on the, our latest users are the only ones that can use it. We still have older users on older versions, so we're just not going to do it at all. The good news is, with the support APIs, it's actually really easy to provide these transitions for users on your latest versions, while still having a default behavior, in this case, usually nothing on those older APIs. So as a side note, it's also important that you know your users and which API versions they're actually using. On Cartwheel, when the app was first launched, we supported Min API 8. Now we're up to 15. So we obviously still have some people who aren't seeing transitions, but where we do have transitions, we support it for 21+. And we actually have 15% of our users who are on 21+. So if your app has at least, I'd say 10% of your users using later versions, it's probably worth starting to do this because that's only going to go up from here. All right, so first up, scenes, because they're the easiest ones to talk about. Like I said, a scene is really just a snapshot of the view. So if you just pull out your phone right now and open up the phone, and whatever's on the screen right now, you can call that a snapshot of a view group. That can be a scene. Then if you click on something else, and then something else appears on the screen, that can be another scene. So specifically, if you want to do a transition between scenes in your own app, it's really straightforward. All you have to do is call transitionManager.BeginDelayedTransition, pass in the root view of the scene, so all the things that you want to animate, and then tell it what kind of transition you want to do. In this case, we're doing a simple fade. And then take our button that so in this case we just want our button to transition, and we're just going to set its visibility to invisible. Now this looks kind of like black magic, because you might have noticed that I'm not calling start animation anywhere. I'm not telling it to go ahead and start making all of my animations pretty all of a sudden. All I'm doing is telling it that I'm going to be transitioning at some point, and then I make the transition. So how does this work? When we call begin delayed transition, the transition framework is going to take a snapshot of all of our view groups, make a scene out of it, and then I go ahead and I update all my views, so I can move things around, I can make them grow, I can make them shrink, I can make them invisible. And then on the next layout pass, the framework is going to take another snapshot of everything on the screen, and then it's going to ask my transition, so remember my fade, how can I get from here to there? So of course the fade animation is going to say, well, this thing was visible, now it's invisible, so the most logical way to make that transition using a fade is to animate from full opacity to no opacity. The framework provides a lot of different types of transitions out of the box that you can leverage. The first one is a fade transition, which I talked about. Explode is kind of neat, but it's one of those ones you got to be careful with. What explode will do is it'll make all of the views that you're making explode move out from a certain point. So it can be cool if you have some things on screen that you just want to go whoosh. But if you have a lot of things on screen and they're all going to be going whoosh, that might be a little bit too much for users. The slide is just a basic view sliding up or in from the sides, off to the side, stuff like that. I actually lied a little bit. These aren't all of them. Change bounds has an entire family of change transitions that do things like moving views around, moving their size, readjusting, those types of things. And then kind of the nifty one is auto transition, which does a combination of a lot of these things. Auto transition is super useful if you just want easy default behavior, and a lot of the transitions that we're going to be seeing do use an auto transition by default if you don't specify one, or something similar to an auto transition at least. So some of you guys have probably already done some animation in the past, and you're going to ask me, what about those transitions, or what about those animations that I used to do? What about Object Animator? That was a perfectly fine way to make things invisible. Or even the view property framework, where you just call animate and then alpha 0, and then it does it. Well, it's called start still, but yes, beside the point. And the answer is that's fine if you're thinking about your views individually. If you want to say, I just want this one thing to disappear, or I want this one thing to move over there. But when we start thinking about our entire screens, our entire layouts, or transitioning from one layout to another, that's when we want to start thinking about using transitions, because you don't want to have to specify these individually for every single view. All right, so let's talk a little bit about activities, and specifically how to use transitions with shared elements. So shared elements are probably the coolest part of the transitions framework, because they allow us to do cool things like this, where we have boxes on the screen, and we tap on them, that box actually expands. And now, you might not be able to tell, but these are actually two different activities. We have the first activity that has all 4 of the boxes on screen, and then we have a second activity, which is when one box is filling the entire screen. These are the kinds of things that you see in the Play Store when you tap on an app, and the icon from the app from the listing screen transitions into the detail screen. So how do we set this up? The first thing you have to do is you have to tell the window manager, or your activity rather, that you want the activity transitions feature and the content transitions feature. Now the cool thing about this is you actually only need the content transitions flag if you aren't using AppCompat or the material theme. So the material theme by default will ask for the activity transitions, you don't have to worry about that. Then you have to give all of your views what we call a transition name. And we'll talk more about that in a second, but basically all it is an identifier for the transitions framework to find your views later. So we're talking more about transition names right now. Like I said, it's just an ID for the transition framework, and everything that you transition will need a transition name of some sort. The first rule is that everything has to have a transition name. It's pretty straightforward. Second rule is that all your transition names have to be unique within a given layout. So this is pretty easy for something like a detail screen where everything is different. Where this comes into play is if you're using something like a recycler view or a list view, where you have a lot of the same views on screen. What that means is that you can't specify your transition name in XML for something like a recycler view row, because if you do that, then everything's just going to have the same transition name, and it's not going to work. you'll notice I didn't say that one of the rules was that the transition names need to match between layouts. And this is where some people get kind of tripped up. If I have a transition name of speaker image in my listing of all my speakers in the DevFest app, and then I transition to speaker details, the second one doesn't have to have the exact same name. It can be something completely different if I want. And we'll see why in a second. So continuing our setup process for activity transitions, the next thing we have to do is start actually doing the transition. So when we're ready to call start activity, first we make a bundle with activity options.makescene and transition animation, and we can pass in our current activity, the view in the current activity that we want to share, and then the name of the transition in the next activity. And then we just set our transitions. And we'll see more of this in a second, but I mentioned earlier that there is a default behavior here. Your theme can also define a default here if you want. We'll see how to specify that in a second. And then we call start activity, intent, and then that bundle that we just created. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the make scene transition animation first. We're specifying pairs of views and transition names. There's a convenience method that I'm calling here that just you pass in one shared view and one transition name. There's also a different version that takes in actual pair objects of views and transitions. So if you want to transition more than one shared thing at a time, you can do that too. And the key to remember here, because this is kind of confusing sometimes, is that the shared view is the view in the current layout, the starting state. The transition name is the transition name of the corresponding view in the next layout. So if I'm transitioning from a speaker detail or from a speaker list to speaker details, I pass in the actual view in the list and then the name of the corresponding element in the details. And again, they don't have to have the same name. So how does this magic work? It's almost the same thing as the scenes, right? When we call that make scene transition animation, the framework is going to take a snapshot of all the views in our first activity, and then once we call start activity, it's going to go ahead and take a snapshot of the second activity after it's done its first layout. And then it's going to use the transitions to calculate how to move things around. Another important thing to know about activity transitions is that they use the window to set their transitions. So you'll see in a little bit that the fragments, you actually call set transition on the fragment itself. Activities, you have to get the window. Another thing to note about this is that means that if you have multiple transitions to different things from one activity, you want to make sure that you're setting them appropriately because the window is shared between, every time you make a transition, it's going to share the same transitions from the window. All right, so we have a couple different types of transitions that we need to know about first. The first one is enter, we have exit, re-enter, and return. These can get really confusing, so I made beautiful pictures to help you. When we do an enter transition, that's how the content in our second activity comes into the screen. So these green boxes. So when I go from here to here, the enter transition for this fragment or activity, whatever it is going to be how these green boxes show up in there. The exit transition is going the same direction, A to B, how those green boxes in the first one leave, how they exit. Sounds pretty straightforward so far. Where it gets a little bit more confusing is when you go the other way. Oh, I guess they're fading out. Cool. So a re-enter is when the green boxes in the first activity come back in after we go backwards using either the up or the back button or something like that from our second activity. Return is how the green boxes in the second activity disappear in that direction. So enter and exit are going this way, re-enter and return are going that way. And just to make it a little bit more confusing, there's actually 8 total transitions that you might need to think about if you include the shared elements. Because what's nifty is that we can do, I'll show this in a second, so you can have one set of transitions for all the content that isn't shared, then a different transition for the content that is shared. But maybe not. So if you look into this a little bit, George Mount is kind of the guy at Google who does most of the transitions framework. He posts a lot about it on Stack Overflow and such. And he recommends, for the most part, when you're doing shared elements, just stick with enter and return. The exit and re-enter are useful in certain cases with shared elements. but generally only when you need to do certain animations before the transition actually happens. So his example is if my shared element needs to lift up off the screen before it moves away or something like that, then you might use an exit or a re-enter animation to perform that action. But for the most part, he says stick with return and enter. All right, so here's an example of how we kind of put all these together. And this text is actually really hard to read. So the green boxes are going to be doing an exit transition. The blue box is going to be a shared element that doesn't enter. And there's going to be a red box over here that is doing just a regular enter transition. So when we hit go, watch that again. So the green boxes are going to fade exit. The blue box is going to do a shared enter transition. And then the red is going to do a fade enter. I spent way too long doing this. All right, and so now we're going to go back the other way. The green boxes are going to come back in with a re-enter transition. The blue box is going to do a shared return, and the red box is going to do just a normal return fade. Oh, there we go. And at this point, we need to make a quick note on timing with these animations, because sometimes our views don't exist right away. Particularly if you're using fragments, when you do a fragment transaction and you commit it, the layout doesn't happen right away. So what that means is if you're doing a fragment transaction and you're on create, then those views don't actually exist when the transition framework tries to make the scene. So what's going to happen is it's going to try to match up your transition names, and nothing's going to happen because they just don't exist yet. Luckily, the framework team thought of that. So we can do what's called a delayed transition. In particular, we can call postpone enter transition in the onCreate of our activities to postpone transition, surprisingly enough. And then we can call start postpone enter transition later on to actually tell it to go ahead and continue the transition at that point. Be very careful when you do this, because we are good developers, and this blocks the transition. So because we're good developers, we know that network operations can be slow. So one use case that I've seen posted for using these delayed transitions is using something like Picasso to load an image from the network. If you're doing that, though, then the transition is going to be blocked until Picasso gets that image from the network. Because network operations can be slow, UI is going to be frozen until Picasso comes back. So be very careful about what you do between when you call postpone and when you call start postpone transition. Generally, did not work. Anyway, generally you can find better alternatives to this, such as prefetching data, or I'll talk a little bit about Picasso, another option for Picasso that we use in the DevFest app. I should talk about that now. So what we did in the DevFest app is you can use the thumbnail that you've already loaded in a list, for example. So our speaker list already has the thumbnail image for everyone. And when you go into the details, we start with the thumbnail, we scale it up, so it's not going to look great, but then transition still works, the picture gets bigger, and then once we actually arrive, we can load the full-size image. All right, I'm hoping some of you guys use fragments, so we'll talk a little bit about how to use transitions with fragments too. It's pretty much the same thing, so there's not a lot to talk about. It's going to be more of an example of how to kind of put everything together. So the first thing we do is in our current fragment, we're going to call, this is hard to read, I'm sorry. We're going to call set exit transition. We're just going to pass in a new fade. What this is going to do is we're going to fade out all of the elements that aren't shared in our layout. So you can imagine in our speaker details for or our speaker list for DevFest, everything that you're not clicking on is just going to fade out. The new fragment that's coming into the screen, we're going to call set shared element enter transition to do just an auto transition on pulling in whatever it's going to be shared. And then everything else in the new fragment is just going to do another fade. And then, once we're ready to do our transaction, it's the exact same thing that you've already been doing. Just get your fragment manager, begin transaction, replace the content. And the only thing that's different is that this time we're going to call add shared element, and just like we did with activities, we pass in pairs of views and transition names. And so you're probably asking, well, what about delayed transitions of fragments? The answer is it's really not good. There is no API right now to do delayed transitions with framework or with fragments. And the reason is it's really complicated. largely because the transactions aren't executed immediately, and there's a lot more complexity in replacing those fragments. So if you're really curious, George Mount has some exciting examples of how you might accomplish this, but it's all very dirty. So you do things like, so you have your existing fragments, you add the new one, but make it invisible, and then once it's laid out, you make it visible, and it gets really messy, especially if you're relying on the fragment manager to do back and stuff like that. So it's possible, but again, I highly recommend finding other alternatives like I talked about with Picasso. The other thing you're probably going to run into, and that I ran into at DevFest, is that sometimes you just don't want to animate certain things. So in this example, you can see our toolbar animates in. That's not really what I wanted. The toolbar is an element that is it's going to be on every single screen in our app, and so it doesn't need to be animating it every time. So the framework, I'm actually, other note, you can define all your transitions in either Java or XML. I'm switching to XML here for simplicity. But what we can do is we can specify that we want to include only certain elements or exclude certain elements, both in Java and in XML. So a few options that we have here are we can include things by ID, so that's the same view IDs that we've always been using. We can include only certain classes. So if I have a fancy widget that I want to make sure I always include, I can say include class my fancy widget. Or we can include it by its transition name. So if you have a transition name for a certain element, and you don't want to give it an ID, or it's not a special class of any sort, then you can also just pass in that name. Excludes are the exact same thing, it's just the other way around. So anything I don't want to animate, I can give it an exclude ID, exclude class, or exclude name. The other thing to note is that, so I have my fade element here, and then all of these targets, all of my include or exclude targets are inside a targets element too. When I first did this, I tried to just put all these targets in the fade, and that didn't work. And because I promised support for everything less than 21, we are going to talk about how to do that. For the most part, we have all this built into the framework. So activity options to do activity transitions just becomes activity options compat. The thing just works. Start activity has actually existed in the form of intent and then in the bundle, which doesn't have to, it's just a kind of an extras bundle that you can use for other things other than transitions. But that's actually existed since API 16. So if you're not using API 16, then you might have to do a version check, but if you're using say 16 plus, then you're fine. And then transition names, if you use the XML Android transition name attribute, then it's just ignored on older versions, so you don't need to worry about that. And then inside your Java code, you just call viewcompat.set transition name, and it'll take care of that check for you. Delaying transitions, it's again the same thing, you just stick support in front. That's assuming that you're using the appcompat activity, which I'm guessing most of you are if you're using material things in general. And then specifying transitions is actually the only place that we should really need to do a version check, and that's because when we call things like new fade, it's obviously accessing a class that doesn't exist on newer versions, so you'll have to check that. Similarly, the window doesn't have a compat equivalent yet either, so you have to do a check there. But that's the only place. And that is all I have. Any questions? Yes?
So, I don't exactly know how to phrase the question, but it's basically like what to do in advanced cases. I had an app where I had a recycler view, and I was using card views. Within the card view, I had a little sub-region that was a box, and so it's like got a number on it or whatever. And I wanted that box, when you clicked on the recycler view item, to animate up to the coordinator layout main part, and I could not get it to work for a couple of reasons. One, because of, I think, the recycler view and the weird card. Like, I wanted the card to expand and fill the screen, and then I wanted the little box to turn into the coordinator layout top part. And it just seemed like the shared transition framework did not want to animate to the coordinator layout. So what I ended up doing is just overrode it and did it manually myself, using get window and whatever. So like, I guess the question is, have you experienced anything like, with respect, or was I just doing the wrong thing?
So I'm assuming this box was an image.
No.
No?
No, it was just.
Well, I have run into some interesting things with specifically images, and then also relative layouts and coordinator layouts, where you have to include, you're testing my memory here. And I want to say it's either change bounds or change transform, which handles the properly resizing things when it's going into certain views or certain layouts. Chet might be. I was waiting for Chet to jump up and say, oh my god, I'm totally wrong, stop talking. He's not saying anything, so I'm going to go with that.
Okay, all right.
I'll add a quick thing that transitions and recycler view don't get along.
Yes.
So
okay.
recycler view is one of those things that's going to be recycling views out from under you. So I would say the general approach I would take is to get the information you need out of that view as quickly as possible and pop it into one of the overlaying or underlaying containers. Like, don't try to make recycler view understand what's going on with the transition. Instead, create a fake view that maybe is transparent to begin with or whatever. It looks like that thing underneath, but it's not the same thing. And then expand that. You know, maybe you actually create your toolbar in place in the container that surrounds the recycler view, and then you animate that in place.
Yeah.
You did remind me of something I didn't have a slide for, which is that sometimes you will have to create your own transition. And that's actually pretty straightforward.
I was just going to ask about that.
There are methods that you get callbacks in your custom transition for capturing the starting values of a view, capturing the ending values of your view, and then there's a method you have to override to actually create the animation to do the transition. Where this comes in handy is right now there's nothing built in for text view, and text view is a bit of a complicated beast because typography. Obviously, there's no good way to animate font face. There's no good way to really animate font weight. You can kind of do size by bumping it up a little size increment at a time, but right now that's not built into the framework. So if you go into the DevFest app right now and you go to the speaker list and you try to do that transition, you'll notice the text is really funky. And that's because it's changing sizes, and I didn't have time to implement a better transition for that.
Yeah, on my recycler view, I was also trying to animate the title from
Yes.
the start to a bigger size.
If
And
you keep the size the same, it's easy.
I quickly found out that what it would do is it would just pop to the end size,
Yes.
the destination
Yes.
size, and then animate. And so I just faded the text out.
Yeah, the fade is an easy fix for that. Any other questions?
The delayed transitions that you're talking about?
Yes.
So you were talking about if that happening in the on create and the view not being there, why can't they start the transition in like on view created or something like that? One of the other like cycles.
So that's actually what if you look at the DevFest app, that's actually exactly what I did.
Okay.
So the speaker details has an activity with a fragment in it that actually has the details. When the activity is created, that fragments layout doesn't exist yet.
Right.
So we have to postpone the activity transition, and I'm calling start postponed enter or start postponed transition in on view created of the
Gotcha.
fragment.
Okay.
So yes, that is a good solution for that.
Can I add a small?
Yep.
piece of information?
Feel free to add as much as you want. You want some slides?
It's a minor point. You were saying that transitions are not available until Lollipop. Activity and fragment transitions are not available until Lollipop. The transition that you were talking about with recycler view or anything that's within views or just uses season transitions, it's actually kick. So
I was
the
gonna
base
make-
transition system came online